I am here to talk about automating API style guides, and this might be something you folks been looking into or want to do or have never heard of. So I'll kind of go through some basics, and at some point we should all get caught up, and then we can look into like how that actually works. So here we go. Yep, you might see me around talking about APIs before. I'm on the internet at Phil Sturgeon on Twitter if you want to talk about bikes saving the planet or anything to do with APIs, including this topic. So a big part of what we're trying to do at Stoplight is help people build quality APIs faster. And one of the things that is the most annoying about working with APIs that haven't really been designed, that have just kind of evolved over time, made by a bunch of different people, is that they're usually really inconsistent. Inconsistency, as well as not being nice, actually causes problems, right? Some of those things, you might have different like random naming conventions, underscores, Pascal case, camel case, and hyphens, and all sorts of different things like that. Different data formats. So maybe you're using HAL or JSON API or Siren, or you've invented something, or somebody in a different team invented something else, and then that different team made a V2, which is also slightly different from the last one. I've had all these problems before, and I'm sure I'm resonating with a few of you. And then there's different security schemes, which means that if you have a client that needs to talk to 5 different APIs, they have to figure out JOTS and OAuth 1 and OAuth 2 and something else, and it's just a big old pain. So then there's unconventional use of status codes. I've had people randomly try and use not not acceptable, because they thought that meant invalid, when really it means you're using the accept header wrong. So all of these things can kind of trip up tools if you do things in a way that's unexpected or inconsistent between different APIs or between different parts of the same API. I've seen a lot of cases where one API has a bunch of different people working on it, and different endpoints will just look and feel completely differently from other ones, and it's super strange. So as I mentioned, apart from just not being nice, this isn't really about like, oh, it's not pretty or whatever. It's more about like these assumptions, these inconsistencies can cause mistakes, and anything that wastes time, of course, wastes money, because you have to fix it, and developers cost money. So when you have a bunch of kind of wacky inconsistencies, people can get used to the way that API 1 might work, and then they'll try and use API 2 in a similar way, and they'll just get tripped up all over the place, and they'll waste a bunch of time constantly checking documentation, and they won't be able to write generic code that works with a lot of your ecosystem or a lot of your APIs. They'll have to use, they'll have to write special custom code for every single interaction they do, and that's just going to waste everyone's time. So it does also look silly to external users, and that can be a case of, you don't look very professional, or it can even kind of bring up concerns of trust in the API, that maybe it's just not going to be very good just because of things as seemingly trivial as naming conventions or whatever. And all of this is just bad developer experience, so, or DX. A real world example that I've seen in 5 different APIs, at least, is when people start off creating error messages, they think they'll just need a string, and then they realize that a string isn't very useful because you can't programmatically interact with it without substring matching. So you start throwing in like an object that has maybe code, with a programmatic code that you can look up and know exactly what the problem is without looking at a string, which might be localized anyway. And so I've seen this happen on an API where the same API between version 1, 2, and 3 had subtly different error formats. So that might be something that can cause problems. And one of those problems is this. We had a bunch of users saying, why does it say object object when I try and log in? Because it's trying to shove a object into something in JavaScript that thought it was going to be a string. And good old JavaScript does this when you do that. So there's a lot of kind of wonky things that can happen with inconsistencies, and there's a lot of different ways people go about standardizing. And we're gonna get to API style guides like real soon. But before that, some of the things that people try and do is they say, we'll just make a version 2 API and this one will be perfect. Or if you're already on version 2, you make version 3 and this one will be perfect. And it never really works out like that. you could maybe kind of make a few new endpoints and like evolve towards a new standard where everything kind of uses the same authentication system and has the same naming conventions, but in the same kind of way as V2, of just kind of, while everything is busted and broken and awkward, all of the developers that are currently sitting around will go, okay, we should work on fixing this. And you put all of this time and effort into fixing it, and then it's just going to diverge over time, and quality will diminish over time. So some people try and do is make a back end for front end to solve the day, to solve the problem. And some people just decide to start from scratch and just rewrite everything in GraphQL and gRPC or Vulkan or Twerp or whatever other random kind of API thing is popular this year. But all of these problems all of these approaches have the same problem, which is, you know, none of them are free of potential inconsistencies. So this is how things might often look. Clients trying to talk to a lot of APIs. And if a lot of those APIs are very different, that client might want to make a BFF, backend for front end, which is where you kind of, your backend team make an API that they talk to that's under their control. And then that API talks to those. And they are good ideas. There's a lot of pros and cons, and they are good ideas, but purely for standardization, it doesn't really help, because when you have multiple clients trying to talk to multiple APIs and they're all creating BFFs, then everyone's just spinning their wheels trying to solve the consistency problem in their own way. And it's just a huge amount of work. So the chances of those BFFs being anything like each other are quite slim. And so client developers trying to move from, you know, between different client teams are going to have a really hard time, because those BFFs are completely unstandard from each other, even though they have solved the problem of API A, B, and C being completely independent from each other as well. So it's just kind of moving the problem and multiplying the amount of work involved with solving it. So some people will involve an API gateway, and an API gateway does solve a lot of the inconsistency problems. If you have a bunch of different security schemes, you can remove a bunch of them, and your API gateway can handle the kind of authentication logic. This can solve a lot of problems where API A is JavaScript and API B is, you know, Node, and API B is PHP and API C is whatever, Go or Java. And those tools have different frameworks, which mean that the OAuth 2 kind of works in a different way and things like that. So what you can do instead is just move that logic to the API gateway, and you can put all of your rate limiting, and you can put a whole bunch of logic and your, you know, permissions, whatever. You can put all of that into the API gateway, so that that stuff is at least standard, and that takes care of a lot of the problems. But obviously things like URLs and the naming conventions for different JSON properties will still be an issue there. So there's a bit more work to be done than just using an API gateway. And so what's left? Most people, usually a lot of companies, will start making API style guides, API design books, API design guidelines. There's a million different names for them. This one website, apistylebook.com, has a collection of all of the ones that are public and known about. And it ranges from everything from Atlassian to the White House. There's loads of these style guides, and they're pretty interesting to look through. They have a million names. It's all the same thing. API Land loves to come up with 10 different names for exactly the same thing. But basically the point of them, great quote from James Higginbottom, is that your goal should be to advise teams designing APIs towards a more consistent API with other APIs across the organization. So kind of converging on consistency across all the APIs. And the sort of things that those style guides can contain are a huge array of different things. Something like picking standards that your organization should use. So instead of having 100 different error formats or infinite different, slightly different error formats, you could say everything should use RFC 7807. Just solve that problem, done. Everything should just use that. And instead of having auto-incrementing IDs in the URLs, so that people can just +1, +2, +3, +4, and just download your entire data set, you can use UUIDs to make them work a little bit harder to rip your data off. You can ban HTTP basic entirely, because it's usually garbage, and you could, you know, enforce that everybody has to use OAuth 2, and you could even say you can use OAuth 2, but you can't use the password grant or the implicit grant. You can get really specific about things that people can and can't do. And even say, like, make sure that when you get the root of the API, then the rest of it's discoverable. Otherwise, you don't have a REST API, you just have, you know, HTTP, RPC. And then the DevOps team, or SRE, or whatever you call them, might want to have a /health endpoint where your application, which could be in any one of infinite different languages and framework combinations, should have /health, which could also be a known format. There's another IRC standard for that. So you can create all these rules. These are just some example types of rules that a style guide might have. Yeah, then you have to figure out where to put them, right? And for years, lots of people have been relying on wikis and just content management systems, static site generators, just anywhere you can write something down, people have made an API style guide, whether that's Google Slides or Keynote or PDFs or CSVs. I've seen it all, and they're all a bit rubbish, because whatever you do, however you actually make your API style guide, it's good to have that written down somewhere, but the chances of every single developer reading through your entire manifesto is quite slim. And even if they do, they won't remember it for a year, you know, and they probably don't want to keep rereading it, so they have to keep coming back to it, which takes a lot of time. Yeah, even if they do remember everything that was there the first time they wrote it, they read it, they're not going to notice any changes that come through. So it seems like there might be a better way of doing this, all right? And so did a very scientific Twitter poll back in July, only 78 replies. I'm thinking of doing this poll again. But when I asked Twitter people who has API style guides, most people don't. A lot of people, 20% use a website or a wiki or a PDF, something that's human readable, but not kind of possible to interact with. 16% use an example open API file, right? So this is something that actually Salesforce do or did a year ago. And they just have one kind of example API that covers as many kind of use cases as possible. And then whenever you're not entirely sure how you should do something, you go and have a look at that. And hopefully there's some comments in there to make it more clear. But that's a bit of a rough way of going about things. And only 11% said they use an API linter rule set, like an automated style guide, which is what we're talking about here today. So there's a couple of different things you might want to lint in your style guide. And some of that is around making better open API, and some of it's around making better APIs. So there's kind of making rules about the meta information, and there's making rules about the information itself. So making better open API might be all about making your documentation look more consistent or look better, or create better quality mocks because you're using more of the open API keywords in order to create a more useful mock or a more useful documentation. So for example, you need to use description fields. It will, you can make it error if you don't have description fields on your parameters, and if you don't have examples or defaults. So that would make mocking better. But creating better APIs, it is all about like making the APIs themselves more consistent, the naming conventions, the URLs, the security approaches you use, all the things that we talked about as problems before. And Stoplight Studio helps with this. Obviously, a lot of you folks will be familiar with Studio, I assume. So it helps you not have to do all of the YAML and JSON stuff all by yourself. But one of the more powerful things is that it has an API linter built right in. And by default, we talk about Open API, that it has an Open API rule set built in. So it will try and help you write better quality Open API, but we don't give you feedback on the API itself, because that would be a tad too opinionated for a generic tool. But you can very easily write custom rules in your custom rule set that do focus on the content of the API. And so some of the rules we talked about before, maybe you need to have a API home. So this is a JSON path that happens to be describing the paths aspect of Open API, just a coincidence, but JSON path, you can Google it to find the syntax, but $paths, and then inside there will be a key called /, right? Because that's how paths work in Open API, and function truthy says that should exist. So we have a list of core functions built in that are all documented up on the Spectral documentation. I'll get to that in a bit, but Here's another example of another rule that extends on top of that and says, if API home exists, then basically it should have a field called get, right? And that should exist. So it means that if you do have a root path, then you should be able to get it. Otherwise, HTTPS doesn't really work. You can get really advanced with these things and you can customize the messages and you don't need to do all this. The main point of it is that every rule has a name, a description. This is decided that paths should be kebab case. So instead of using underscores or camel case, then everything should be like that. And we've solved that with a bit of vicious regex. You can use any regex. There's a bunch of different functions and regex is just one of them. But, some that came in from the community, we call this one Semver. If you want to have in your info version field, please use semantic versioning. And again, just a simple bit of regex for that one and says it needs to have a number and then a number and then a number. So 1.0.3 would be valid, but 1.5 wouldn't be valid because it's only got 2 numbers in there. So another handy one, no HTTP basic. So it will look inside the component security schemes. And if it notices anybody using a scheme which matches basic, then it will throw an error because please don't use basic. And this one, also pretty powerful. This looks a bit funny, but when you get the hang of JSON path, it really is very powerful. It's almost like a programming language in some ways. It's very similar to XPath or CSS selectors, the same kind of concept, but you can basically say, look in the paths inside all of the objects, look for responses and check to see if there's any properties that match 4 or 5. So any status codes, and look at the contents of that. So basically we're looking at the contents of any status codes that are errors in the response. And we're using the enumeration function to say the only values that are allowed are vnd.api, which is the JSON API MIME type, or problem plus XML or problem plus JSON. Those are the 2 valid MIME types for RFC 7807. So bit intense technical speak there for folks that aren't necessarily so technical, but yeah, you can basically build a function for, you can build a custom rule for pretty much anything. And when you can't do it entirely with JSON paths and the built-in core functions, there are, you can build custom functions as well. So you can just throw more JavaScript at it to make it work. But yeah, these are some from the community. Patch requests cannot use application/JSON, right? You can add descriptions to these and documentation links so that people can find out why they can't, because just saying, don't use this, it's bad, it isn't so helpful. You want to say what they should do instead and why they shouldn't do the thing or why they should do the thing. But here they've just got another rule that kind of helps with that. And they say, we prefer the application merge patch JSON, which is a really interesting RFC if you aren't familiar. So yeah, please use this approach, which tells you how to handle patches. And like I said, you can build custom functions and you can distribute your rule sets as NPM modules, right? You can use them anywhere that Spectral runs, which works perfectly fine in Studio. Here's an example of a custom function, a custom rule running inside Studio. Anything you put in that description is just going to pop right up there in the error. But then it also works in the CLI. So Spectral is just an NPM package you can install. You can install it via Docker or a few other ways as well. And that means that you can use it in any kind of workflow that you can imagine, really. Like if you use continuous integration, then you can run it in Jenkins or Circle CI or whatever to make sure that people are following the rules of the rule set in all of their pull requests. So they literally won't be able to send any bad Open API or create any bad endpoints if you set it up that way, but obviously you have control over how CI works. And yeah, you just kind of get this output of error, warning, info, hint, whatever, the name of the function that went wrong, and then more information about what the problem was. So a Spectral CLI, and this can help developers as well, especially if they're using kind of editors that don't have support for Spectral, then they can kind of run this locally before they send pull requests or whatever. If they use VS Code, we have a VS Code extension for Spectral. And again, the same rules will apply, and you get little squiggles and warnings and errors, just like anything else, like ESLint or whatever. We built a GitHub action for Spectral. So if you don't have CI set up, you can just kind of enable this GitHub action for very simple CI. And even if you do have CI set up, it's nice to enable this because then you get actual comments on the pull request showing where and what the problems are. And so often when I talk about this stuff, people are like, well, you can't just completely replace API design reviews with a couple of rules. And that may well be true. I mean, it is true. But a huge amount of the work that your API design review teams or governance teams or center of excellence team, whatever you call them, a huge amount of that work can be replaced by rules, because a lot of the time they are checking the same stuff. Like, you can't use this error format, you can't use this naming convention, you should use hyphens, or, you know, the limitation of what Spectral can do as far as these style guides is pretty much limited by like the JavaScript you can write, the data sources you have. You can you know, spell check. You could say, here's a list of banned words that aren't allowed to be used in any part of the API. You could do pretty much anything, but at some point you still need your API design reviews to make sure that what's being built is useful and doesn't collide with another API that might be working on something similar, or kind of just makes sense, or hasn't used a certain generic word in the wrong way, right? I've been at companies where account could mean about 25 different things depending on who you were talking to. So maybe you'd want them to say, like, this should be a company account or a, you know, financial account, or different types of account in different ways. So you still do need the design review people to exist, but Spectral can just make their lives a lot easier, and maybe some of them can go back to doing something else instead. And so that is it for this talk. But this webinar is themed around Spectral questions and answers. And so please, if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
All right, Phil, we have one question right now typed in the Q&A function. So Aaron Bao asks, can you provide a collection of the 100 most popular rules? Does that exist somewhere?
Ooh, I don't know about 100, but I have been collecting together a whole bunch of them. Yeah, give me a sec. So over here on style guides, there are a couple that are starting to come together. So we have one for OpenAPI. Somebody started working on one for Fire.
Are you sharing another screen now?
Yeah, I just realized I did that. So OpenAPI Contrib is an organization. We've got a repo called Style Guides. I'll share the link. But there's a couple of rules in here that are quite interesting. Someone started working on Fire a while ago, the healthcare stuff, and those are some interesting rules. And I've been putting together APIs you won't hate. It's super opinionated and optional, and you can use it if you want. But it's got a bunch of these rules that I've just shown off today, and we're going to add a few more. And headers need to be Pascal case, and, you know, hosts should be HTTPS only. A bunch of interesting things like that. So yeah, you can play with these to get started, and I'll put that link up in the chat now.
Can you find it?
No.
Well, send me the link and I'll make sure it gets sent out in a follow-up email.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Well, that's the one question we had dropped in. Anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask Phil? Okay, so we have one from Jeff. Do you have a rules testing strategy you suggest?
We've not really been doing too much testing on rules, just because you can edit them in Studio, and then you just see the response. So I just kind of edit them until I get the error message. But yes, some sort of testing system would be quite interesting at some point, seeing as it's like a brand new DSL. You know, it's a brand new thing that doesn't exist. It's quite tricky to make tools for this stuff, but the developer experience for creating and managing rules, we are planning on making that easier over time. But for now, you can just mess around with them and see what happens.
And then another question we have from Karen Barlev. How does Spectral integrate with IDE?
Yeah, so right now, VS Code is the most popular kind of IDE around, and I don't mean that to be a controversial statement. People prefer their own, of course, but it's the one that has like the most number of users. So we focused on making the VS Code extension first. But for everybody else, you know, if you have a terminal in there, just a CLI terminal, you can run Spectral CLI in there, and it will complain at you if you've got any errors. So we're looking into making more integrations in the future, but for now it is just VS Code.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions? We'll leave it open for a little bit. I'm honestly surprised you're not being bombarded with more.
It's hit or miss, right? We had that one where there was like 50 questions, and then
right.
Not so much.
Okay. From Jordan Nunez, we love VC-based configs and specs. I know you have a GitHub integration, but how can we pair monorepo specs and PR reviews together?
Ooh, monorepo specs and PR reviews together. I'm not sure. I'm not sure it would matter too much that it's the monorepo because, that's interesting. I suppose with the GitHub Action, that could get a little bit tricky because you're going to have different rule sets in different places. But so a large part of Spectral is that you're kind of meant to share rules and rule sets across multiple APIs. You know, the idea being you can distribute these rule sets and have them available on a public URL so people can kind of reference them in their projects, and whatever you go about doing, generally multiple projects should all be using the same kind of base rule set at the very least, and then maybe configuring them a little bit. And where it gets really different is if you have some that use OpenAPI and some that use async API, right? You might have in the same code base, you might have a couple of HTTP APIs and a couple of async APIs. And so we do support the concept of formats, and you can create rule sets and say, you can create rules or entire rule sets that only apply to certain formats. So you can say, hey, Spectral, if you see an OpenAPI file, apply all these rules or this entire rule set. And if you see async API, then go and apply all this other stuff. So you could mix and match content from different types of format in the same monorepo quite easily using the GitHub Action. But if you have very different APIs that have very different rule sets, you'd probably want to go back to using Spectral CLI, and then you just have the checks where you say, hey, Spectral, check this project with this rule set, and check this project with this rule set. Yeah, that should work fine.
Awesome, thank you. And then another question that we got, and I think the answer to this is yes, but I want you to confirm. Does the collection of rules you shared all integrate with Stoplight?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, let me just share my screen again because I feel like that talk was originally made for a conference where they're like, you only have 20 minutes to get through all this stuff. I was like, and I felt like there's probably could have been a few more slides in it. But if you would like to learn more about all of this stuff, open source, Spectral, and we have a whole bunch of documentation right here. And I am going to answer your question. I wasn't saying just read the docs. Rule sets. So these rule sets, usually just a spectral.yaml, spectral.json, doesn't matter. These will be picked up. They look like this, and they work throughout the entire ecosystem. If you're using Studio, then the file just lives in the root of the project, and you'll see integration with yeah, I mean, these Spectral rule sets will show up in this sort of way inside Studio. The same rule sets work in the CLI or in Studio while you're editing. In the future, no promises on when, but we are working on like a governance module as well, because so far everyone wants to work on API governance, but there's literally no tooling anywhere apart from Spectral that I found. And the whole idea of governance would be it would kind of collect all of these things. You've got API generating these errors, API 1 generating these errors, and API 2 generating these. And this API is using this rule set, which is the most basic rule set, but this other API is using the more advanced rule set, and so they get more points. And just kind of gathering all of the warnings and messages coming from different parts, different APIs that you have, and kind of funneling that all back together so that your API governance team could easily look at all of that information and say, like, right, these APIs are doing amazing, I don't need to worry about them too much, but like, oh boy, like these APIs seem to have a lot of problems, and we should kind of spend a little bit of time helping them work through some of those issues. So that's where it's going. And for now, yeah, it still shows up while you're editing in Studio. But there's a whole bunch of integration right now, and there's just going to be more and more over time.
Awesome, and great segue into the next question from Elena Kulik. She asks about additional information regarding rule set integration with AWS gateways.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's something I really would quite like to work on, because AWS Gateway doesn't support OpenAPI or JSON schema. They support like Amazon flavored OpenAPI, which is very different. So Spectral itself, we don't want to be the people that make all of the rule sets for all of the things all of the time, right? We're at some point going to work on a kind of a marketplace concept, and the most rudimentary beginning of that is kind of over here, where we have this kind of community of a few different contributors working on different rule sets, and one of them is the AWS Gateway, and these are all the things that differ about the AWS Gateway that you have to think about. And it's a perfect example of something that Spectral should be doing, because there's all these kind of odd rules, and path segments can only contain alphanumeric characters, hyphens, periods, commas, and curly braces. Path parameters must be separate path segments, and they've got all these rules about stuff. And just one of is banned, just it's perfectly valid, but you can't use it in AWS Gateway, just tough. Can't use these things. So you could create a bunch of Spectral rule sets, and because of the way that, let me get back to the docs a sec. Because of the way that using rule sets works, you can use the core built-in one, or you can use any kind of custom ones in any different way. So like the name of an NPM module, or a URL, or just a local file, or any combination. And what I quite like the idea of is having this kind of default Spectral OAS be part of your organization-wide like main API style guide or main rule set. I kind of use those terms interchangeably, because a rule set could be anything, and then an API style guide is a rule set that focuses on like how your API should work. But you could have like a base API style guide, and then you could also have a AWS Gateway rule set, and you just load both of them for any APIs that are going to be behind the AWS Gateway. And so while people are designing the API, like while they're writing the Open API before they've even bothered coding it, they're going to get all that information and all that feedback about like, oh, that won't work in AWS Gateway, to save them from going through the entire development process and getting to the end, putting it up to the gateway and realizing it's broken. You could just kind of use it. So if anyone is super excited about working on AWS Gateway, come talk to me. But I have it on fairly good authority that a lot of those weird quirks have been removed in AWS HTTP APIs, that awkwardly named replacement for AWS Gateway. That's just HTTP API. But that should solve some of those quirks. So I've not spent too much time on the AWS Gateway rule set, because we might not need it if that thing solves that problem instead.
Awesome, thank you. Another question from Jeff Marquez. Is there an optimal repo structure for custom rules and functions to best integrate with both Studio and CLI?
No, doesn't matter. Let's have a little look. If I open up Studio. Yeah, the way that it works, you've just got the main Spectral file, and Spectral Studio will actually show you about how that works. So we go into sample specs. Computer's about to take off. Probably should have stopped Dropbox from whatever it's doing. When you go to create a style guide, pick what formats it's in, OpenAPI 3, sure, and create it. And it will just, make the file for you. And I have this little preview thing where you can kind of change the inheritance or the change the severity of things, and then you can go in there and kind of code it yourself. So generally speaking, just put it in the root and call it .spectral.json or .yaml if you prefer not typing brackets all day. And yeah, the only other thing needs to be done is if you want to make functions, by default it uses functions. And of course, these functions will only be available to inside that repo. So you might want to go with an npm module, but yeah, learning about folder structure for things like sharing and distributing, we have a document on that here. If you just come on over and search for, sure, if you just search for npm, it'll probably find it, but yeah, there you go. So you can kind of learn all about the different approaches to distributing and custom functions, and we have documentation covering custom functions too. So by default, I think it's in functions. You can override that. Where is it? You can change the name of it somewhere. Yeah, there you go. So you can just point it to different things. And some people have experimented with Git submodules, right? So you can kind of use that approach to share custom functions between lots of repos if you want, but npm is probably a lot easier if you can get your folks to figure that one out.
Awesome. Thanks, Phil. All right, next one. This one's it's a little long, but I'm going to read it all out. Our team is more truly full stack. The engineer that is writing in the FE code, in the front end code, is writing the app code and editing the Open API spec. So there are a lot of contributors versus an API team being gatekeepers. We are thinking about using a templating tool to make it easier for full stack engineers that don't spend a lot of time into that. What are your thoughts on something like JSONnet or true JSON referencing, so we don't have to follow Open API ref rules, compiling to Open API?
Ooh, that's interesting. I don't know what JSONnet is, so I'll be honest about that. Yeah, I mean, I meet a lot of teams that have a lot of full stack developers, and when the person making the front end is the same person who's making the back end, and there's some confidence that that is going to stay that way for quite some time, then a lot of the kind of design first arguments can kind of fall away a bit, because a lot of it depends on your company, on your developer structure, your engineering structure in general. And so, design first is wonderful when you have somebody who wants to create an API and share it with the people that might be consuming that API to get a bunch of feedback, and for them to play around with it and see if that works, before the back end team run off and build something that's completely useless for the front end team. But if you don't have that separation, then it doesn't really matter as much. And so however you choose to create or generate your Open API is at that point more just personal preference. For example, we support the code first workflow, and we have people that write a bunch of code and put annotations in there, and then they just export those annotations into a generated Open API file and then just publish that. So they're just using Stoplight for docs. But then they have another team who is a back-end only team who generates the entire API through Studio by designing the entire thing, and shares their mocks around and gets people to play with those mocks first. And then if that's any good, then they kind of build it whilst the front-end team is building it. So yeah, you might not need to. Not entirely sure if that answers your question, but it was an interesting question regardless.
Thank you. So the next question I have is related to licensing right here, Phil. And I want to say, I think I might be able to help answer this. So the question is, how is the licensing with the CLI used in a CI/CD process without using Studio? So given that Spectral is available open source, they should be able to to access it for free. Is that right? If they don't need Studio as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the licensing for Studio is actually very permissive. It can't remember exactly. It's like it's not the WTFPL, but it will let you do pretty much anything.
Right.
So I'm only mentioning the licensing for Studio as a side point because it's not entirely relevant, but I would like people to know about it. The license we use is the Attribution No Derivatives 4.0 International from the Creative Commons. And you can basically, it means you can use Studio for free. You can kind of, I think you can share the download with other people in your company if you don't want them downloading it from the website for security reasons. But you can decompile it and change it and then sell it as your own, right? Which seems like a pretty reasonable license. So Studio, there's no quirks, there's no gotchas. You can use it in whatever industry you're in. You can use it to make money, or you can use it for charity, you can use it for whatever. But Studio is only using Spectral. Spectral is the linting validation system that we've been looking at. It's just kind of used by Studio. So this is completely free, open source. Use it for whatever you like. The license is MIT. Oh no, sorry, I was wrong. It's the Apache 2 license. And again, it will teach you everything you can do with it here, but they've got their kind of summary up top. And yeah, we're not liable for anything that goes wrong. There's no warranty if it breaks. Just send us a bug report and we'll try and get to it. But yeah, you can use it for commercial use, modification, distribution. So you can use Spectral inside your inside whatever type of continuous integration system you've got. And you can npm install it or use Docker or use whatever you want. It's all just free and open source.
Awesome.
Oh, and there is this one thing that scares a few people. We call it treeware, which is a project some folks made that just say, if you like it, say thank you by buying us a tree. Instead of buy us a coffee. We've got plenty of coffee. You can just buy the world a tree instead if you like it, but you're under no legal obligation to do so.
Awesome. Great. Well, that was the last question I had. We'll leave it open. We have 15 minutes scheduled for any other questions. Well, great. Thanks everyone who stuck around and joined us for the whole session. If you do have any additional questions that pop into mind, feel free to reach out and we will do our best to get your questions answered. And any feedback that you have on the session as well is greatly appreciated. I will be following up this session with a recording as well. Any final words, Phil?
Oh, thanks for letting me talk about Spectral. It's always fun.
All right, great. Thanks for your time. Bye, everyone.